Wayne, one of our principles for Taxon Works Together is that we have people introduce themselves first. But I do want to sort of start with a little story in this case, because I think it's kind of an interesting synergy or I don't know, singularity that's come together. So one of my first like exposures to the scientific literature and diving into the literature was, I think it was a fourth year arthropod biology class, and we had to write a research paper. And for some reason or other, I don't know, I can't quite remember the details why. And I tried to figure out if I had this paper in place, but this was a long time ago. I decided to do it on jumping spider vision.
Oh,
And
wow.
at the back of my head, I'm like wondering if maybe you were involved in some of that. And, um, it was one of the first times where I got the feeling for how you went and found a paper and you read it and then you went to the references cited and you followed that chain all the way through. And it was an experience where I realized that people were doing something that I thought were just cool, these jumping spiders. They were looking at essentially mounting them on live and then trying to figure out what colors they saw by shooting lasers in. And because jumping spiders have this behavior, you'll describe it much better than me, where they're doing a wide pass, but then when they see a prey, they'll start vibrating much more rapidly. And by looking at those two classes of vibrations, if I'm getting this right, they could sort of narrow down what colors that spiders were seeing. So this was really fascinating to me. It was also fascinating that it linked the biology to a definite engineering sort of impact. I was at University of Waterloo, and it was a big engineering school, and I had thought about being an engineer, but I saw how hard they worked, and I'm like, oh no, I'm going to be more generalist, and I went the arthropod way. But it was a really wonderful sort of first introduction, and I don't know why, but it makes me think, okay, now I'm talking to a jumping spider person years later. And so I thought maybe we'd kick off and you could say something about jumping spiders and why they're cool as a way
Wow.
to get
Okay,
going.
so yeah, about the vision, I haven't directly done vision studies, except
Uh,
now I'm connected with a group where I'm providing the sort of phylogenetic and evolutionary context for thinking about
yeah, yeah.
the evolution of color vision. Um, uh, the experiment you described, there are lots of ways that you can get at how is the spider responding, and one you've just mentioned is watching the main eyes, which are like long tubes. And so one of the things that probably people don't think about when they think about an eye, they think about either it's like a vertebrate eye where we go like this to look around or we move our whole head, or say an insect eye where if they want to look around, they have to turn their whole head.
Yeah.
But the idea of only part of the eye moving to shift vision, so the lens stays fixed and the
Yeah, yeah,
retina
yeah.
moves.
Right.
And so they've got little straps of muscles suspending all
Okay,
of
okay.
this
Yeah, I
and
remember
moving
now.
the back of the eye. So that there's currently all sorts of amazing things done by actually recording the videos of the retinae, and so they can actually now. Jacob's lab and Hoy's lab and others have looked at how those retinae are moving, what they're looking at any given moment in the visual field, and by
Wow.
changing in a video, like they make them watch videos, and by changing the contrasts and colors, they can start to tease apart what exactly they're distinguishing. I think the other thing that I might mention, well, one thing about jumping spider vision is that the angular resolution at its highest point in the jumping spider eye is actually better than a cat's. And so this becomes a huge miniaturization issue of trying to get enough photons into each photoreceptor and yet make it small enough in a little head that small, that there has been interest among the nanorobotics people as to how you would
Aha.
mimic jumping spider vision. The other thing that I think a lot of people don't think about when they think about jumping spiders, well, first of all, whenever I've told people, oh, I work in jumping spiders, and these are, say, people that know nothing about spiders or jumping spiders, and I just see this look of horror come across their faces, and I realize, what is it? And then I realize they're imagining they'll be walking along, and this spider will
Yeah.
jump from the trees upon them. But the thing that I think people might wonder about if they looked at one and thought about it is why doesn't it have big back legs? How does it
Ah.
jump?
Yeah, yeah.
And the reason is the muscles that power the jumping are not in the legs. They actually jump by hydraulics.
Yeah.
And so the muscles that actually make them jump are in the rest of the body, clamping down and making blood squirt down into the legs, and then they pop
Very
forward
cool.
like that. So those are two factoids are about jumping spiders.
Cool. I want to ask one more question about jumping spiders, because you used the word mimicry, and it always struck me like thinking about what do very small things see. Like there was some, I can't remember what the context was, but like well, they kind of just see these blurry things at some point you learn. Like they don't have the greatest eyes, so they're just kind of seeing these blurs out there in the world. And yet we have insects and arthropods, et cetera, that have incredible mimicry, right? Like and then they have these incredible intricate behaviors with jumping spiders. So it always struck me that maybe the visual, the things that they're forming, the images that they're forming, are much more acute or much more high resolution than we sort of think. And can you say anything about, like how many pixels per inch a spider is seeing, or
Yeah, it's
what's driving this evolution to look so familiar at that really precise level?
yeah. We don't. I mean, for a lot of the mimics, we don't know what the selective pressures are, who from whom the selection pressures are coming. So, is it a bird?
Hmm.
Is it another little spider? Is it another other sort of arthropod? There's some indications that some of these probably are coming from other arthropods. Uh, um, but yeah, so they can be quite incredible. They're ones that I struggle to distinguish from an ant sometimes.
Uh-huh.
And, I've got a pretty strong search image. But there's so much remaining to be understood about the mimicry. About the vision itself, though, the one thing that uh, one has to realize is that they can have a very good angular resolution, like
Mhm.
ridiculously high compared to what you'd think. But whether they've got the brain power to
Yeah, yeah,
form
right.
an image that's anything like what we would recognize, or whether they're simply abstracting from that some critical little edges or something, and that's really what carries forward. And
Mhm.
and it's super hard to know. And my bet is that with jumping spiders, that the pixel density that they've got is probably flooding the brain, that little tiny
Mhm.
brain, with so much that there's probably a lot of interesting evolutionary games being played about, that the male is overwhelming the female's
Mhm.
processing capabilities. And that's why she says
Ah,
yes, not because it's
aha,
actually a good
aha.
signal
Fascinating,
or
fascinating.
whatever, right?
Yeah.
So there's amazing research being done now trying to push that pipeline, the understanding of the pipeline deeper and deeper. And the best I can say is stay tuned. It's something that I just watch. I don't really participate in, but it's just amazing research. So,
Okay. So stepping back, Wayne, can you just say a little bit, introduce yourself, and say a little bit about what you're working on and where you're coming from these days?
recently retired, and I really want to work on the spiders. This is why I got into this. I just love the diversity. I'm really at heart a spider taxonomist, like species distinctions. I mean, the phylogeny is great. It's a something where the classification really matters. I want the classification of the spiders to reflect phylogeny accurately, but I just love going out into the field and getting them and drawing them and understanding them and so forth. So that's really where my heart is right now. But I suppose that's sort of like for me, that's the what is my nutrition. But I also find that programming can be a little bit like chocolate. It's just it's like it can be a bit addictive and you love it and it's cool and everything, but I gotta limit it. So what I'm doing on the programming side now is David and I are working on version 4 of Mesquite. And so that's a push that might last another couple of months. It's a little hard to know. But after that's over, my expectation is that I'll really be spending 80% of my time with the spiders.
Uh-huh. How does that feel, Wayne? Like, how does it feel to pivot from somebody who, is responsible for a piece of software that, I don't know, maybe you could say a bit about what the community of Mesquite users looks like how many
Mm.
people are interacting with you, and do you feel like you're, I don't want to use the word like, you know, departing from that community, or what's your
Well,
relationship to the Mesquite users community? Let's start it with that.
yeah, it's an interesting thing that we don't get. Well, first of all, we had a list serve, but
Mhm.
that's sort of like, evaporated the way listservs
Yeah.
have sort of evaporated over the years. We started up a Mesquite Facebook page, but we don't like it's not even the listserv did not attract a lot of commentary, which uh, might have to do with the fact that people didn't have many questions, which seems surprising. But we're getting in terms of citations, we're getting like 600, 700 a year or something like that.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
that's each one of those is a direct impact on research. And I think that that's something that, the Taxon Works people can be proud of every time somebody cites it. It's not simply a throwaway citation in the first paragraph of a paper. It actually means that you've had an effect
Sure.
on research.
Yeah.
Um, we're going to start a Google Groups just to try to improve the communication, especially with version 4 coming and a lot of new things being added. Um, so there's something that, that if I'd like to say something about, I realized as I was thinking about this, what is part of the orientation that we took towards building McClade first and Mesquite? Like sort of
Yeah.
what was the impetus?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I show a slide?
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay. I'm gonna do this and open. Oh, it's going to be right here. Okay. So we started McClade first, but in 19, well, it started in 1985, but this is what it looked like in version 1 of 1986.
Are you
Oops, I'm not
sharing?
showing it to you
Yeah, I was
yet.
gonna say, are you
Yeah,
sharing? Yeah, I still
yeah,
missed.
I'm
Yeah.
not showing it yet. I'm still sitting at the, hold on, screen sharing failed to start. Please try again later.
Oh, that's strange.
Let me try again. Okay,
There you
there we
go.
go.
You got it. You got it.
Okay, so this is McClade version 1, 1986. And really, when I saw the first Macintosh computer, it was like, oh my God, just think about what you could do looking at trees,
Mm,
right? And
mhm,
so this was like, it was great fun, right? It was like, oh, now the ideas that I've had in my head about trees and everything, I can actually manipulate things. I can see, get instant feedback and so forth.
mhm.
And and so one of the reasons that we built this was because it would be so cool to be able to visualize a tree and play with it. But
Yeah.
in a way, one of the big things behind it is that we didn't quite, in those days, it wasn't like you did a whole lot with computers. When we first started, and this is so different from the communities that we see today, there weren't very many stars in the sky. I remember using
Yeah. Yeah.
NTSys and then Philip. And then there was WagProc, which was the predecessor to POP. And they started to build, but there were very few stars in the sky. And now the sky is full of stars with different magnitudes. And of course, now that R and Python and so forth have a smoother ramp to gaining knowledge, things like C and Java, there's a sort of a step that you have to take to get into the community, to get into the libraries, the programming and so forth. Especially Java has a pretty high overhead in terms of the libraries and the classes and
Hmm.
everything. You actually have to move into their universe.
Hmm.
Whereas with R, it's sort of a slow ramp, which means that people can get in just as users and then um, gradually graduate to becoming programmers. So there are, people who've done little bits, people who've done lots, and so there's so many constellations in the sky nowadays. And so when we first started this, yeah, there were people doing analyses, but um, and using computers, but it was some felt important to not simply rely upon the output of a meat grinder. You stuff the stuff in the top, turn the crank,
Uh-huh.
and out blops something, right? There's
Uh-huh.
the answer, right?
Uh-huh.
And so for us, I think McClade and then Mesquite was a lot about placing the concepts and the decisions into the minds of the users. It was what now seems so old-fashioned. It was to give agency to the user rather than to the computer. That's the way we really saw it. So there's a real emphasis um, on user interface. Like that's
Hmm.
in a sense one of the big things. It's a very user-centric thing,
Hmm.
and it's partly for other users, but also partly for us because we wanted to, follow what was happening and not just simply rely upon a static output. So just a couple of slides about the history. So McClade went through a number of versions. Version 4 was in 2000. But even as version 4 was being developed, we realized we wanted to add a lot of things. And so initially I had a sabbatical so I could try to take a crack at adding a new modular architecture grafted onto Mesquite. But the constraints of history were too big. It couldn't
Hmm.
be done.
Yeah.
So we
Yeah.
had to start from scratch, which was important, but also it then allowed us to go cross-platform because we could pull ourselves away from the Macintosh operating system.
Hmm.
So development of Mesquite started in 1997. We're now over 300,000 lines of code, over 1,000 modules now. And it's a pretty weird system in that even though it looks like sort of a shrink-wrapped GUI program, it's uh, all sorts of little pieces on the inside, and it's not like Mr. Potato Head where you've got a big core and then little plugins. The
Yeah.
whole
Yeah.
thing is like Lego, basically, and maybe not coincidentally, it's the running version of Mesquite. All the instances of the modules form a tree, and it's
Uh-huh.
basically an employer-employee hierarchy. And so this is how everything works. There is no big core. There are libraries that everybody can share and make use of. And then, of course, the data in any given project are shared. But just to give you two little ideas about the modularity as it relates to the user interface, menu items, basically employees can request a menu item, say, I want a menu item, and it basically gets inherited into the nearest ancestral window, for instance.
Hmm.
And a Mesquite is fundamentally a command line program.
Yeah.
Everything is internally is all about scripting, and so when you move a mouse, there's a little text command that goes whizzing around saying, "Hey, the mouse just moved," and this allows the self-scripting by snapshots that is accumulated likewise through the employee tree. So it's a pretty bizarre system in a way, and somehow it holds together, and it has not required that much deep architectural maintenance over the years, except keeping up with bugs in Java for the most part. So version 4 is going to be really much about phylogenomics, and that's because David and I need that. So one of the things about being a user developer
Yeah.
is that really for the last while, we've mostly been doing things in Mesquite because we've needed them for our own work. And because of the rise of R, especially, a lot of the analytical stuff in phylogenetics has moved to R. It might have happened in Mesquite if the community had adopted the modular architecture and decided to contribute modules there. But that overhead of Java was, I think, just too high
Hmm.
compared to what you could do in R. And so R has really taken over so much of the comparative analyses that for us as users, Mesquite has become much more of a data management and analysis management tool. So I say transparent pipelines there, and that's the idea that as you're processing your genomic data via Mesquite, you get to see things along the way.
Uh-huh.
And that's again agency of the user. Um, so we've had communication with RaxML, IQ-Tree, and so forth over for a number of years now, but now they're built in effectively. So it's pretty easy just to interact with these external programs. And the other thing that we've put a lot of time into is a lot better metadata handling. So being able to read beast trees and get all the metadata for heights and all that stuff, right? And so there'll be things like chronograms and so forth. So that's version 4. And as I said, it really is very much about like the way things arose is very much about what we needed, David and I
Hmm.
needed in our own work.
Hmm.
And then we're also thinking ahead to 4.1, where we're going to stick a lot more about species delimitation and species trees.
Hmm.
So, anyways, that's a little bit of a stuff about
Yeah.
Mesquite
Thanks for that
and
update.
Mesquite. But this idea of being user centric from a GUI point of view. I
Hmm.
mean, I look at
Hmm.
I look at TaxonWorks and I think, oh my God, how would my life be different if I, had entered the field now? What would I do? I could so easily see getting heavily involved in helping to program bits of TaxonWorks. And I
Hmm.
think where I would focus on is actually the front ends.
The UI,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's what I think
yeah,
I would do.
yeah.
That's what I
Interesting,
would
Wayne.
naturally head
Yeah,
towards.
yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it's what makes, so I had a grant, an ABI grant, where I think we got it because we paired with the information science school, and I worked with Mike Twidell, who's an expert in human-computer interactions. And I learned so much from that. I think I learned more than like the students we had and what we shared about, the kind of little tricks and tips that they think about when they're building interfaces and what kind of gains computers give us. Computers are very good at certain things, like, he was talking about the primacy of having like the access to your recent data, or like peeking in the future, or thinking about these repetitive tasks, but putting those forward as sort of UI elements. And so it was really exciting to do that. And things like the radial menus and stuff are coming in TaxonWorks, are coming out of that kind of perspective that we wanted to explore different avenues of presenting data. And it's actually interesting that we had our a high school intern that came in and looked at TaxonWorks, and there were some discussions from a hackathon. And like this getting familiar with the UI is a little tricky, right? Like it's kind of a steep curve, and it's kind of abstracted there, mostly because we needed to get going and starting, so we did it one way. But they were thinking about, okay, now how do we improve that with like a little wizard that kind of gets you familiar with the interface or that kind of thing. So I think there are a lot of interesting UI challenges, and I think a lot of what we're actually presented with in terms of merging data or operating on data is a UI challenge right now. We have this conversation about a lot of collections want to have their names with the most up-to-date name, right? Like they don't want to have synonyms in their as determinations in their collection. So there's requests to like, I just want to have them all updated. And really, you don't want to have them all updated, right? I would argue. I think you want to be presented with a set of options to update these if they make sense, right? And if we do just kind of do these automatic tasks, just like you were saying, we're not seeing what's going on behind the scenes. And then we're all of a sudden, when we come back to it a week later, it's like, why does my data look like this, right? So
Yeah.
giving people that agency to understand what's going on with our data, I think you nailed it. It's really critical.
And it's a tough thing being I mean, maybe it's actually been good. It's a tough thing being, one of the issues with being, say, a user developer is that you can get so much into something that you
Yeah.
forget what
Yeah.
it was like to look at it for the first time. And so I mean, there's so many
Yeah.
things about Mesquite that we got used to, like, or anything I've ever done, I guess. And it's like, oh yeah, right. Why does it do that stupid thing right there? And you sort of
Yeah.
click it away, and then
Yeah.
you click it away, and then you suddenly. So it's actually maybe been good that we haven't like focused 100% of the time as developers, or always
Yeah.
working with me, because we come back to it in a year, and it's like you'd forgotten your automatic response to get rid of something, and then it's like, why the hell, like
Yeah.
you're a little bit of a naive user again, right?
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
like, and then you finally, I'm going to do something about that,
Right.
right?
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So maybe at some point we need to have somebody come out and interview you guys and kind of make a like ask you like why is it like this, right? From a user interface perspective, or like,
Yeah,
what was going on in your mind when you presented it? And just kind of like there's some design principles or some like, tufty kind of
yeah,
visual display of information ideas there that could be teased out maybe.
yeah. One of the things that of course is always there is just the constraint of development time. And
Yeah.
so I mentioned how menus and snapshots are built in Mesquite and everything, and it's I think that basic modular tree-like architecture is the reason that we could actually do this with a team mostly of just two people, right? And build something that big, because it just seems to have really cleanly worked, right?
Yeah.
We do something, it sort of transparently happens. We don't like it, just something about the division of it just works. But it means that for the user, right, menus are dynamic. It's a little hard for them to know where things are. So we built a search routine, for a
Uh-huh.
search thing so that the users can actually find, where the hell was that? Like, where is that menu item, right?
Uh-huh.
And so it means that what makes it easy for us to develop it is not necessarily what makes it easy for the users to
Sure.
build a consistent knowledge. And so
Yeah.
you could imagine things where frequently chosen menu items have a certain, adjustment or whatever, right? Things to
Yeah.
support the user. And there was this moment in the after Mesquite was like, I don't know, it's like been in development for like 3 or 4 years. And I know that not all people might agree with me, but I looked at it and said, oh my God, using this feels like I'm using Windows, Microsoft Windows. And then I
Uh-huh.
thought, oh, that's the difference. Microsoft Windows is written to be easy to program, not it's not user-centric in the way I'm used to, because I've been
Uh-huh.
using Mac since 1985.
Yeah.
And so there is a user-centric perspective that really puts the user front and center that is great, but
Uh-huh.
it takes a lot of development effort to do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So, there's something about the primacy of what you've done. I, by hook or crook, just yesterday I was reading, got home from this, and there was a paper that popped up with my son. I was a YouTube short or something. A great way to get things in front of it. There's a mite phylogeny that shows that mites are now paraphyletic, and it had to do with the how the mouth parts are formed. But you know what? The figure in there is not even mesquite. The figure in this paper came out of Florida, maybe some of you know about it in chat, is from McClade, right?
well,
Like the screenshot figure for
they've
this
got
big
hold
new
on.
phylogenetic difference is from McClade. I'm
They've
almost
got a
positive. It's
yeah, that's
amazing.
cool.
Yeah,
They've got a machine that they keep the dust
yeah.
off
So
of it.
so we were talking a little bit. We were talking a little bit about preserving Java and stuff. And the Internet Archive does a wonderful job of, for example, they have these virtual machines where they're recording all these Flash apps that basically became impossible because they were blocked
Yeah.
out of browsers. And it struck me that there should just be an obvious one that for some of these early phylogenetic software that there could be a little node in the Internet Archive that is a virtual machine, because it's very easy for them to virtualize any of these old Macs,
Oh,
and
that's interesting.
you can use it right online there, right? Like I go play all these old arcade games, Gauntlet and these kind of things that I grew up with coming from a family with no TV, and these
Yeah.
arcade appears downtown. There they
Yeah.
are on
Yeah.
Internet Archive. Yeah, yeah.
That's a really intriguing idea. Like the Mesquite, the McClade version one that I showed you was on Sheepsaver. It was an emulator, but that's a local
Uh-huh.
emulator, right?
Uh-huh.
And I have tried to use the online emulators of Mac to get McClade started, but there was like anyways, it was a little complicated, but if they came pre-built with a certain
I
set of
don't know the
software, that'd
exact
be cool.
details, but I
Yeah,
know
yeah.
that there's some systematic, like Internet Archive tends to be a little bit more chaotic than some things, but people have put concentrated efforts in some areas, and some of
Yeah.
that has been serving emulation live in the browser. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
So I'm wondering if we should go back to that modularity, and I think you maybe just described it well enough that the modularity emerged for you, as a way of thinking about how to program. And I love that reference to the fact that you recognize it as a tree now, and maybe there was some kind of way to organize your code that came out of the way that you were thinking as well. But it seems like it sounds like you're saying that modularity in your code came right at the very beginning, right? Like you didn't,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
So it's we were initially it was trying to take McClade as the Mr. Potato Head body and start grafting new ears
yeah,
on and
yeah,
stuff like that, right? But when that didn't work, it was like, okay, let's rethink things. And and I think it was because of that failure. And a lot of things you do better the second time round, but
yeah,
I'd actually gotten a fair bit of some of the principles, but it was like, let's be clean. So it was almost like a religious fervor
yeah, yeah,
initially to build it as clean as possible in terms of
yeah.
modularity. And what that meant was there's some peculiar things. There isn't quite as much inheritance as we might have in an
Hmm.
object-oriented programming language with inheritance. Of course, all the modules have some base physiological functions, right?
Sure.
But they could have been stacked in some places more deeply in terms of superclasses and subclasses. But instead, the idea was is that instead of specializing by subclasses,
Hmm.
have it so that you have what would have been your base class,
Hmm.
have that as a manager module, and then have it hire employees that do the specialized bits,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so it turns out that we probably go a little too far in that way in cases, but I think that fervor to really try to make it so that there isn't a lot of depth in a standard object-oriented programming way, but it's
Hmm.
instead replaced by independent units that
Mhm.
call each other
Well, it sounds like,
has
yeah.
has really, it's like, I think that that's why it works, right?
So that's
That's why it
fascinating
could
because
work.
I think what you're describing, if I'm going to abstract that, is two things. There's a classic, in game development and software development, there's two sort of classic approaches. One is the object relational model where you have inheritance, and the other is the ECS, entity component system. Sounds like to me that you just naturally went into this very well understood ECS framework where you kind of mix things together as you need them, and you kind of naturally just kind of went that route. And when you do that consistently, it's extremely powerful. A lot of game programming, from my
Mm.
understanding,
Hmm.
requires that when it scales, right? When you get very complex,
Yeah.
you need to be able to pivot and change your things on a fly. And that ECC, yeah, thanks, entity component system, is exactly the way to scale it up. So it sounds
Yeah.
like you
No.
kind of just went that route instead of more of an ORM.
Yeah.
And to be fair, that in TaxonWorks, we do a lot of that balancing as well, right? Like we do some inheritance, but we've got a lot of shared modules that we can stick in, and we've spent a lot of time thinking about our classes of data and keeping them all at the same level so that when we build out annotation, we've got these annotation radials that can allow you to add data attributes or notes or confidence levels or tags, all these custom attributes. Because we did it like that, it doesn't just work for one class of things, it works for everything.
Yeah.
So, there's these same things where we just drop in one line of code and you can tag it, right? And
Yeah.
that flows all the way up into that little radial UI elements. We don't even have to touch the UI part of it. It's just that, hey, we know about this now. It needs to appear here. So there's a mixture
Cool.
of sort of
Cool.
ORM and sort of entity components.
Yeah. 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 So one of the things that became sort of a guiding principle at times during this development was whenever a new kind of function was needed. So, for instance, we had trees. We want to calculate a number for a
Mm-hmm.
tree.
Mm-hmm.
Almost always, if possible, try to do at least two different versions right from the start.
Ah, wow.
And it's basically, or try to do the most different versions. And that way, the basic, the method signatures and so forth will be more likely to be to last into the future if you really tried to push the alternative styles of that particular niche, right? And then the other thing is that because of this idea of a niche, it's easy, and this may be different from some other things too, I don't know, is that you can swap on the fly, like live. And that's the idea. It's like you say, oh, I didn't want that number, I want that number. So you fire that employee and you hire another employee for the same role, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that, anyway, so yeah,
So
cool.
it sort of describes to me, so that gets me to the question, and maybe it's about your future development. What you describe is what I would interpret as your early thoughts about doing unit testing and writing tests. So right now, I would argue that one of the most critical things that we can do in our scientific community, computing, and one of the things that has just benefited our group so much is to have unit tests or tests in our code. So when you have some function, right, that calculates that tree number, right, you create a little fake scenario in your data that defines the tree and you know what number it should. And then your test that runs says, take this input and give me this output, and it should be this. And what you're doing there is you're basically creating a small template so that, yeah, you can swap in your different niches, whatever you want. And then when something breaks way down the road, 5 years from then, you come back and you say, oh, it's breaking because my function that I optimized because there's this new math library that does it 30 times faster, gives me integer instead of course, this doesn't happen in Java, but instead of a real number. So one of the things that I try to recommend to programmers who are playing with R libraries, and I think I called Milton out on this, or building these scientific compute libraries, is you should absolutely be thinking about adding tests to your framework. The other thing that does is that every single commit to our code base in TaxonWorks goes up to continuous integration on GitHub, and we run, I think it's 4,000 or 5,000 tests now on the computating, so that these complex nomenclatural calculations that we're doing, everything to like that this thing pops up on the screen. Now you've got to be careful because people have realized that test first framework can be overwhelming. You don't want to write tests for everything. it was proposed originally that you write tests for everything, and that just bogs you down. But
Mhm.
when I find whenever I'm trying to do, some recursion on a tree or something like that, where it's a little bit tricky, that teasing out that and writing out that test is sort of like writing that pseudocode recipe in my mind, and it also formalizes it. So I write and I start with tests when it's something that's going to be complicated, and I know I'm going to have to like play with the algorithm or
Mhm.
take a couple chain a couple of different methods together. So I'm thinking about with Mesquite and maybe the longevity of that code is, are there any unit tests in there, or do you have a proxy for that?
Not nothing that's archived.
Yeah,
It was all at that moment. It was all like, oh, okay, I'm doing this recursion, da 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 da. I better, try it out. Oh, this is probably going to be a complicated case. What if there's a zero length branch there?
yeah,
Okay, I better try that, right?
yeah,
And so do it. But yeah, I think, it's always felt whenever there has been time to work on Mesquite, given that, the complexity of it and the size of the code base, it's always felt like you were just doing what you needed to do at the moment.
yeah.
But the idea of doing it in the planned way, the archived way, the way that you talk about is it just, partly it was ignorance. This
It
is
did
all invented on the fly. Like
well.
I'd never
These,
heard of entity component systems before, and eventually I heard about unit testing and stuff,
Mhm.
and David and I basically figured this out all on our own. Our only, I think, our only training in computer programming was in high school with Fortran. I
Mhm.
think that's the only stuff I can remember doing. So yeah, but it sounds like the the unit, some sort of unit testing, and I think the idea of archiving it is really good, but we haven't done it.
Yeah. Okay, Wayne, we highlighted a couple of questions before, and we've been talking a lot about software and software development, but you've also been publishing, you published a recent paper on species concepts that I confess I didn't quite get through, but it felt like, oh, I'm back in my graduate studies, and I'm like, I wish I had this paper for this context. I will admit that, the years of experience and building up and sort of recognizing who you were citing and that kind of thing only could have happened over a couple of years, but what a summary. And maybe we can link to that paper that it came out in the Systematic Bulletin, right? Systematic Biology,
Yeah, Bulletin
Bulletin of Systematic
Society.
Biology. Yeah, so it's on species concepts. So maybe you could just say a little bit about, I get the idea that you were trying to sort of summarize to your students or summarize and to have this kind of resource that you could say, hey, this is what we're thinking about. So maybe you could say what the impetus was for that paper, and we'll link to
Yeah.
it in the chat.
So it's species concepts are something that at various times in the last 50 years there's been a lot of discussion about. You don't see a ton of discussion nowadays, but when I was in grad school, for instance, people were talking about a lot of different things. Meyer was still around and still pushing,
Mhm.
and there was the monophyly versions, the various phylogenetic species concepts coming around, and of course, when I first got into the game, the phoneticists were still quite vocal, and so there were a lot of ideas, and I just grew up in a time where people were discussing ideas. So it got planted in my mind as one of these, sort of somewhat thorny problems. And I really pretty much assumed that it was a problem that was like, oh, well, if you want to answer this sort of question, then this is your best species concept.
Uh,
If you want to do that, then that's your best species concept. And I was just, I didn't really think about working on it. But because of my gene tree species tree papers, which in 1997, a philosopher, Matt Haber, call contacted me about possibly participating in a symposium, and then one thing led to another, right? And this was in late 2016, I guess. And so Jeanette Witten, with whom I was teaching evolutionary biology, and I started talking about it. We decided to work on it together. We both had an interest, but we came from different perspectives. And we didn't know where it was going to lead. And so we just spent a lot of time thinking and talking and writing and stuff. And really, I thought that it was just going to be, oh, here's a summary of ideas that people have had. Here's the pros and cons. There you go. Right.
mhm.
And what astounded me was that I actually developed a very strong opinion
Ah,
about the right species concept for most uses, right? And that's really what shocked me, that I never expected it to come that way. So yeah, it was a weird and long and in the end sort of exciting journey.
So
Yeah.
what is that concept?
Okay.
Can we break it down in
Yeah.
five
Okay.
minutes?
Yeah. We'll see what we can do.
Yeah, yeah.
Of course, I got my little. Da, 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 da. Um, there we go. And so this is our canonical diagram was this. And basically it's about the species concept. And I hate to say call it species concept because it's sort of a non-species concept because we basically reject the idea of an intrinsic rank, which, the monophyly people like Brent Mischler say. Uh, and so it's about the cohesive and isolating processes of the recent past. So on the right is basically a cartoon of what you might think of about the biological species concept, in that it basically deals with the thin slice of the present. It's about a particular set of traits that have to do with reproductive isolation at this moment. And the big problem with it is that those traits have yet to leave their footprint. They're happening right now. This is about reproduction right now. And so that's the reason that it's so hard to distinguish. You've got like, how do you go do it? A taxonomist is so much struggling because the absolute current slice of time, the isolating processes, haven't yet left their footprint. So what we say basically is, look, you need to think about those processes, but in the past. You need to look back into the past and basically make a model of the isolating processes that led to the present day, because those are the ones that left the footprint that we can now access. And it's different, though, from the phylogenetic species concept in the monophyly version, not in the traits version. The traits version is something else. It's basically more phonetic. In the monophyly version, it's different from that because the monophyly version is only about genealogical history. It doesn't directly incorporate processes into the concept, whereas we're saying what really matters are the processes, right?
Mhm.
So this is this idea of it being retrospective sort of summarized it like this. A living species is like a train you see as you arrive onto the platform. Large, intricate, still hissing, smelling faintly of hot oil, its passengers exiting in mid-conversation. You see it in front of you at this moment. But you see, what you really see when you look at it is not just the way it is right now. You can sense that history. You know that it's just arrived. You sense the traces of its recent past, and that past is deeply part of what the train means to you. So when we look at a species, what we're really trying to understand is recent history, right? We're trying to understand the processes that arrive to the phenotypes and genotypes we see today. So it turns out, and this is the weird thing, it's like, oh, this is a new concept or whatever. We never really, we had planned to try to avoid as much as we could coining a new acronym or new initialism or whatever you want to call it. But we ended up having to because we couldn't really find the way we saw it in the literature. So coalescent models are already there, right? The tubes represent these past processes. So what we're basically saying is what species are is the recent two parts of the tubes, right?
Mhm.
Of isolation and cohesion. But it turns out that morphological taxonomists have basically been doing the same, have been inferring the same things implicitly, not explicitly. And so there's a couple of rules of thumb that I learned growing up as a morphological taxonomist. And those are like emphasize reproductive characters. And you might say, oh, well, that's just a nod to the new synthesis and current reproductive isolation. But it's also looking at implicitly ongoing and past isolation. You look for at least two characters, right? Two distinctions. And that's basically about linkage disequilibrium in a way. It's about not
Mhm.
just a standing polymorphism, but then we always look at geographic patterns. And that's got to do with past and ongoing isolation. So I'd say really the morphological taxonomists have certain ways of thinking about things that really do mimic this idea of trying to look for
Yeah.
the echoes of the past isolation that have led to the phenotypes and genotypes we see today. So one in your little notes about questions, you said you commented on a Blue Sky post that I did about why haven't people paid much attention to this, right? And so here's a little cartoon about why I think people haven't paid attention to it. Here are taxonomists doing their stuff. And so let's just imagine their species concept is the hat that they wear. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So they're wearing bluish hats, right?
All right.
Let's not worry about what that is yet. Okay. So Meyer comes along and says, you all should be wearing golden hats, right? And the taxonomists say, but golden hats are too expensive and hard to find. Taxonomists, though, continue to wear their bluish hats, but they think now that they should be wearing golden hats, right? DeKiros comes along, and so Kevin DeKiros is, especially his 2007 paper, but he's wrote these ideas before that, is often now cited, especially say in integrative taxonomy, as sort of the species concept that anchors the work. And what I would say about his paper is that it's, as a philosophical paper, it's really cool. Like his ideas are really cool, but they don't help much empirically because they see species as sort of timeless entities spanning time, entities that span time.
I see,
By not being anchored in a clear time frame, they're not empirically accessible. They just don't guide your research, right? So he says you should be wearing colored hats, and the taxonomists say, "Yay, we're wearing colored hats," right? But it's a bit too vague to actually guide the research, right? So what we said is, actually, you should be wearing blue hats, and in particular, this very precise color of blue, right? And the taxonomists didn't really notice because I guess they were too busy with their work, but also because we really didn't necessarily push them off their game, any ones that did notice it. But why does it matter? So that it matters because precise concepts are needed to guide precise methods. If we want to move on, so the coalescent modelers are already doing this, right? They're already working on it. But if, say, from the morphological perspective, we likewise wanted to start accessing these ideas of process and so forth, and that's what we were inferring, you'd want to start building those models and talking about the morphological variation in those terms, which is certainly not impossible. I mean, people in the morphological, there are morphological papers from the 60s, people talking about incomplete lineage sorting of morphology, right? It actually exists. So to delimit a species really is to model the past. That's actually what we need to be thinking about. And so if the revolution happened in phylogenetics decades ago, I think this is only just beginning to happen for species now over the last decade or so. And so I think that as people refine the methods and they want to go to the second or third or fourth decimal place about species, then maybe they'll come back to our paper and say, oh yeah, of course, that's what we're trying to do. So in your little notes, you had asked about taxon work and how it might better support things, right? And could that have something to do with it? And so the obvious thing to do is to add to species records the inferred parameters of their history of cohesion and isolation. It's like, oh, this is not just a name. It's not just not a name is something separate, right? But the object in the database, that's the species, would have associated with it, in a sense, the argument for that species, the argument in terms of the process parameters that have been inferred and so forth, what the evidence in logic is. Which, interestingly enough, of course, the international codes punted long ago, right? They said you had to have a diagnosis, but they didn't talk beyond that, right? They just, we're about naming, right? And so the one thing that is, I don't know deeply, how taxon works work, but it certainly got the data there, and it certainly got the names there. But to what extent does it have the link between the data and the names, right? Or the data and the concepts of the species? In other words, the metadata, the arguments, and so forth. And not only could then TaxonWorks actually just record the evidence and logic and the parameters inferred about cohesion and isolation, but of course it eventually could do it if it's got the data, right? And in which case then TaxonWorks graduates into taxonomatic.
Right.
So that's
yeah. Thanks so much, Wayne. That was an amazing summary. I want to, one of the other questions we asked, I think it's a little meta, but I think it relates. And seeing what you're doing with Mesquite makes me think that this is a question worth asking. Is, the question was to you is like, can we not see this utility, or can we not explore this concept of species concepts because our digital tools don't let us aggregate data in a certain way, or they don't let us compute in a certain way? So when I see you updating Mesquite in all of these different ways, maybe you're doing that because you want to explore these species concepts and you require a digital companion or a set of functionality to explore this space. And so maybe why Mesquite is why it is because you've been thinking about creating these sort of cohesive analytical ways of thinking about it as a tool. And you need to have that to actually ask these questions or explore these questions or see the consequences of adopting a certain kind of species concept or perspective. And I just wonder about, like,
I
yeah,
I don't, I don't know the answer. For sure, with respect to McLeod and Mesquite, was there was a conversation between concepts and software, right?
yeah, yeah,
That they fed back to one another. I mean, the basic visualization of McLeod of those branches painted with colors,
yeah.
it came. Uh, I don't remember what David's example was, but my example came from a 1981 paper I gave where I wanted to somehow express what amounted to incomplete lineage sorting in chromosomes.
Hmm.
And I learned about incomplete lineage sorting from a chromosome, the cytogeneticist, long before anybody else knew about it, because the cytogeneticists knew about it in the 1930s, right?
Yeah, well, yeah,
But like to me, it was like I wanted to see it because I wanted to think about it, right? And
wow.
so there's a lot of stuff even now in Mesquite where it's like, oh, I want to be able to look at it this way so I can think about it more clearly, right? And so
Mhm.
yeah, and which means once you can think about it more clearly, then your ideas can grow,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
But with respect to species concept, that hasn't, we haven't really gone there yet. Species concept, the link between the species delimitation and Mesquite isn't strong yet.
hmm,
Um, there's no reason it couldn't, right? And so I think that with respect to taxon works, as coalescent modeling starts to hit taxon works in a deeper way, as you integrate genetic data more and so forth, and if you do start doing anything even vaguely automatic, right? Where
yeah,
it's
right,
actually telling you,
right,
it's like,
right.
you could have something where you flag a
Hmm.
species by saying,
Hmm.
oh, everybody's been like taxon works. Please flag all species that the data within taxon works suggests somebody might better revisit.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
can imagine something that does that, and
yeah.
then it's like, oh, once you start that, then the path is that taxon works development could feed back into not only species concepts, but concepts of individual species.
Yeah.
So
So we very much architected it that way, right? Like we have we use the phoneticist term OTU, but we kind of stole it back from him. I like to joke to make it like the species concept is the work the OTU concept is the thing you're doing work with, and that can pivot and change, right? Like we don't have any primacy of what the nomenclature. Nomenclature is
mm,
handled as the
right.
ICZN handles it, and you can do that as some, we almost call it objective, right? We're just recording the literature, we're not interpreting it. But all of the biological data gets attached not to the name first, but to these
Yeah.
OTU concepts.
Hmm.
And we have this, basic object called the observation, and we have descriptors, which are just characters and character states. But the ways that we can already pivot through this, I'm seeing it emerge with these, we call it unified filters, where I can go from any concept to set of observations to images, and we can go back to sequences, but we can pivot really nicely on all of those
Yeah,
axes.
yeah, yeah.
And so Heidi has been one of the first people to do what I wanted to do years ago, was to actually start working on a monograph and to start teasing out completely specimens from scratch. And as you alluded to, we're going to want to do this with DNA. Um, and like help that guide. And like you said, one day we'll want to do a little kind of quick analysis. The first obvious one is just plot my specimens on, and then circle them and add a quick, put them in a new bin, put them in a new
Yeah,
OTU,
yeah,
just because I want to work
uh,
on those.
yeah.
So I think we're really set to do that, and it's something that has excited me from from day one. It feels like we're almost at this little singularity. Like if you stick around for the business meeting in about an hour, I'm going to talk about at least proposing that we think about switching from capturing the past, right, which we're
Yeah.
really kind of focused on, to sort of capturing the future and the in situ data capture and the de novo
Yeah.
data capture. So
Yeah.
it's something that excites me a lot.
Okay, cool, cool. Can I, hmm, there's actually a little quick slide thing that I wanted to show,
Sure.
but you just question about modularity and taxon works and being basically an alternative front end. We have done things with Mesquite to databases that sort of never really went anywhere because we just, it was an
Yeah.
avenue to explore. Could be, I don't know. Like, I don't know
So you might
about
not
the,
even have known this, but the initial data model in the initial observation descriptor model was influenced by, I think, Walter Berenson did a Access database that has a couple of really cool features. Like the idea is that you observe something once in TaxonWorks, and any there is only one matrix, and matrices are just views on data, right? So if you observe something by putting something on a specimen or even an extract or an OTU, once you've made that, that sits independent of any matrix. So when I call up any combination of OTUs and descriptors, if I've observed in that intersection, that data appears right in the system. And that came out of, I think, Walter's view of things. And the ability to quickly throw together data sets back and forth was really primal. But when I was adapting that model that was used in MX into TaxonWorks, we actually worked with Julie to think about the API that serves that data back and forth. What would it look like to be capturing that in Mesquite, but actually persisting it in TaxonWorks? So it was it didn't go anywhere, but it was an early experiment that actually influenced how we build out the API. So I think there are some sort of, if you had a class of data that was a virtual matrix in Mesquite, and you just said, instead of entering the data, or just like you said, when I get an input in this cell, instead of putting it here in the file, put it over there in TaxonWorks. I think that could happen pretty quickly.
Yeah, fairly quickly. Well, depends
not
that's
like
the thing.
this,
You
but,
just never
yeah.
you never know when you suddenly do that, like, oh, I had made that assumption 10 years ago, right?
Right. So one other thing on that regard, Wayne, I want to just get in there, is that it's an interesting side product. I just want to touch on the fact that about 12 or 13 years ago, oh man, what's the name? Rutger Voss and they came up with this format NextML. And the idea was that we weren't exchanging data nicely in Nexus files, and so Mesquite, MX, and TaxonWorks, we produce NextML, but to my knowledge, nobody except Lucid in some strange way is actually using that as an exchange format. And it's been this interesting question for me about what standards stick, and whether or not applications are more important than standards. And we don't have the time to go down that path, but I thought I'd bring it up.
I think just a quick comment there is if NextML had been around 10 years prior to when it showed up, probably that would have been our base format in Mesquite. The one thing about Nexus is Nexus itself is somewhat XML-ish in philosophy, like skippable blocks and everything. And it may be that was just enough flavor to keep it back. So I want to answer Valerie's question, but if I could just really quickly show something, because this is a message that, as a phylogeneticist, like maybe I'm better known as a phylogeneticist, that I just want to say, because it's something that I've talked about, Valerie, about isolation parameters and everything. Think about coalescent modeling, and it's super primitive now in a way. It's like, okay, you got this. Suddenly at this point of time, they split and they're 100% isolated, right? So just imagine now if you subtly shaded that. So it's like, oh, they're leaky with this value. There's this population. There's also populations. But as you add parameters, you start to get to that richness that we're eventually going to need. Okay, I wanted to show this because you had asked in one of the things about, 10 by 10K by 10K phylogeny, and sort of TaxonWorks supportive phylogenetics. And obviously the things that it does in terms of linking sequence data to specimens, to collections records, to phenotypes, to species identification, like so many of us that work on phylogenetics, especially in the genomic world now, we're constantly struggling with maintaining all those links, right?
Yeah, and, I think it's still the case.
It's a huge thing. But I just wanted to say that this is something that I've given in various talks, but it's just like a perspective that I think not enough people think about, is if this is a portion of the tree of life, and we think we're doing a great job on phylogeny, right? Like I get my data back and it's like, oh my God, we nailed it, right? It's like, I know now the relationships among most tribes of jumping spiders. And it's just like, I never would have predicted that 20 years ago. So we sort of think we're nailing phylogeny, but this is how densely we actually know phylogeny. That more than 80% of the species of the tree, the leaves of the tree, are yet to be discovered. So from this perspective, we barely know phylogeny at all. And so for many questions, these deep branches are sufficient, but they're often not. So, diversification studies are obviously seriously impacted if we don't know the detailed texture of phylogeny. And comparative studies can be highly biased because what ends up being sampled is going to depend heavily upon the nature of the organisms, right? And so I'd say that species taxonomy should be viewed as the most urgent task in phylogenetics. right? And so even if the only thing that TaxonWorks does is basically really support well and accelerate species discovery and
Hmm.
species description, it's like probably the biggest thing it can do for
That's
phylogenetics,
enough.
right?
I love
That's
that. I love hearing that take. It's, yeah, very interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that. Okay.
I
It
think we ran
feels,
out of time.
I think we ran out of time. In the interest of not oversaturating our brains so that we can remember those wonderful little nuggets, we'll call it. Wayne, thanks so much for participating. It was
Thank
a
you for
super
inviting me.
pleasure. Yeah. Thanks. And we didn't get to the dystopia, but I'm happy for that, right? That
Yeah,
we
so
brought
for those of you that
up.
don't know, taxonomatic is is
Yeah.
is a little thought experiment in the species concept
Let's
paper.
share that link to the post in there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I just got to say this meeting, I wish I had sort of, obviously I'm thinking about other things these days and these years and these decades, but I just think what you guys are doing is amazing. And I think that this meeting is just a wonderful thing. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, it would be so cool. We could do so many other, like I almost want a nonstop meeting, right?
Yes,
But
yes, me
anyways,
too.
I, I'm going to talk to you guys about other possibilities. So anyways,
Sounds wonderful.
thank
We
you.
will share the taxonomatic. Make sure you check out Wayne's blog. Wayne, did you want to did you want to give yourself a shout out? Can we follow you on Blue Sky? Can we,
Yeah,
do you want to
I should be easy to find. I just use my real name on, I don't remember what it is. I think it's Wayne.Madison at BSKI social dot, whatever. But also, my blog, which isn't well maintained, is waynemadison.wordpress.com. So,
Okay.
okay.
Thanks again so much. We'll be sharing those links in chat. And thanks again to Wayne and
Thanks.
everybody for being here this morning. An incredible morning.